Hey YouTube, thanks for checking out my channel. And today I want to talk about gauges on 97 F250. Now this gauge setup is for a big block Ford. A small block is going to be a little bit different, obviously. But on the big block Ford, on a gas engine, a 460, the 7.5 liter, I'm not going to show you step by step, but I want to point out some key steps as far as getting these gauges on your truck and some of the things you have to look out for. Now in this case I've used electrical gauges. These are from Autometer, and I'm going to put the link down below, not only for the 3 gauges that I've used, but also the pillar pod that I used. Now any 2 5/16 inch gauge from Autometer will fit in this pod, and the nice thing about it is the Autometer gauges with this Autometer pod, they just push in. They just kind of secure themselves. You don't have to worry about the brackets that you tighten from the back to keep them in place. Although they come with them, it's not necessarily needed. So let me tell you what I've done, and again point out a few of the key factors of getting this thing put together. Here's the gauges that I have now currently installed, and there's a couple of things that you need to be aware of inside here. And that is, the instructions tell you to drill 3/16 holes and use these little Christmas tree push pins to actually secure into the old pillar by pushing into the holes that you drill. Well, I wanted to utilize the screws to some extent also, and you can see that here. Here's a screw here, and I've used this screw here, and what that does is makes it a little bit more secure. I like that better. Now you do have to be aware, if you've got brittle plastic like I do, some of this stuff doesn't line up so well because you're putting quite a bit of extra plastic in there, so it's something to be concerned with. As far as the wiring goes on this, it can be a mess, that's for sure, and you can have all kinds of stuff going on. The best thing to do is to pull this dash out, and the way that you do that is first remove a couple of screws down here. There's one there, and then that one right there. You're going to pull off these trim pieces here. These are just push on. There's one here, and again there's one here, and behind there's a couple of bolts or screws that look a lot like the ones that I just showed you down here. You're going to have to lower your steering wheel, and also make sure that you have your wheels chalked. You're going to turn the key on, not start the engine, and move your gear selector down, and then this dash will pull out and up and out. But you have to remove your light switch, which if you look here, there's a little area in which you can put a screwdriver and depress that metal tang backwards, and then this will pull off with some force, but it'll pull off, because you do have to pull out your light switch too, and that's so you can tie into your dimmer on your lights to run the lights that are inside here. That way whenever you dim your dash lights, you'll also dim these lights. And where I'm going to show you here on the switch, it's a good place to tap in, and just make sure you do it securely. It's the only way that you're really going to be able to get into that and tie into that switch. There's a big difference if you haven't done it before and you're trying to figure it out, so that's why I'm kind of showing you here. Also, the wiring for these gauges. There are 5 connections for each gauge. You have a positive for each light. You have a negative for each light. You have a negative to run the gauge. You have a switched on positive to run the gauge, and what I mean is when you turn your ignition switch forward, it's going to energize these gauges. And then you have a sender wire, one that goes to the trans in this case, one that goes to the water neck in this case, and one that goes to the oil pressure sender again in this case. Your gauges are going to be different as far as where they go, but still you're going to have one wire going to senders, and then those other wires that I mentioned too. So that's a total of 15 wires that would be run from underneath this vehicle up to these gauges, but you can get away with a lot less. So what I've done is I tied into a bigger gauge wire, and instead of running 18 gauge wire to these gauges for those features, I ran 14 gauge wire, and the smaller the number, the bigger the gauge, and 14 gauge goes up and into the first one for the light on the ground and the ground for the gauge, and then it goes to the next one and then on to the next one. That way I only have one wire that's going up, a thicker wire that takes care of all the ground wires. So I get rid of 6 wires with one thick wire. And again, the same thing for the ignition switched on power wire. It's a thicker gauge. It comes from the fuse box. It is a fused wire. So basically there's a 20 amp fuse. I don't need that much, but it just so happens I have an extra 20 amp fuse that's not being used in here. And it's for the ABS system. If you have an F150, which you shouldn't for a 460, but if you have an F150, your ABS is being used. But on an F250, there is no rear lock ABS, so you can run off of that fuse, and that power wire goes up, and again, it piggybacks into these 3 gauges. So you have essentially 6 wires going in instead of 15. So that made life a lot easier. Now, in the case of a 460, like this engine is, this is normally the water neck that you have on your vehicle. And there was nothing wrong with this water neck, but what I wanted to do is retain my stock water temp gauge inside my vehicle, and I did that by changing the water neck. Now, as far as this water neck, this is off of a pollution controlled 460, and you got to watch because a lot of them are 90 degrees. And what I mean is, if you look at this, it's kind of at a 45-degree angle where it mounts. Most of them at 90, so they basically go straight up and straight over into a right angle. So found this on eBay, and again, this is for some sort of pollution controlled 460, probably from a big Lincoln Town Car of some kind. And it gives you a couple of bosses that are tapped and a couple plugs. So you can see I still have the plug in this one, and the reason that I went with this one back here with the sending unit that comes with the gauge is because this puts it more in stream and it heats more rapidly that way. And again, I'm doing this so I can retain my factory coolant sensor, and that's this sender right here that's got a wire going to it. So now I can see what my gauge used to read inside, and I can see what the new gauge reads. But the sender's pretty basic, and if you don't want to retain your factory gauge or your factory gauge isn't working, you can just unscrew that sender that I pointed to there and just put this one in place of it. There's a couple of adapters they give you, and they have one that adapts to the right size. Actually, I believe this size would be correct for that hole too. Now, the next one I'm going to have to show you a photo of, and again, trying to retain my stock oil pressure sender, I went ahead and got a T-block, which I just picked up at the local auto parts store, and that T-block was then tied in to the block with the factory sender being screwed into it, and then the aftermarket one. And the configuration that I've got there is probably the best as far as the way it going in. I didn't want that big sender, first of all, to be on its side, because that's a little bit of a, you know, a chance of shearing off or wearing out to some extent, because it is bouncing up and down whenever you're hitting bumps. So that I have it upright, it really takes and makes all the weight and everything distribute straight down. And then the factory oil pressure sensor, it goes in place there, and you can see what it looks like. Now, all these wire connections, I kind of recommend that you go with some sort of convoluted tubing, and it protects the wires. It's going to be running across a lot of the hot engine, and there's a chance of chafing and possibly shorting out to some extent, and I really don't want to have to mess with the wires any more than I have to. And quite honestly, you know, the factory ones are wrapped up pretty good, and there's a reason for it. They know that bare wires get messed up. So that's what I've done here. So the final sender then is going to be the transmission, and let me show you. This is an E4OD that I have, and you can see the connector right there going to that little brass fitting. Now, this is a test port that is from the factory, and it is easy to get to. You just remove it and a little bit of transmission fluid will come out, and then you just slide in the sender and tighten it down, and of course put some sort of pipe thread protector, Teflon, PTFE, whatever you want to call it, so as to make sure that you don't leak. And then in this case I added this wire and I kind of looped it down. That's kind of a drip edge, that way all the water's not running onto the sensor necessarily, but I'm sure it's still going to get pretty corroded up down here. I might paint that with liquid electrical tape or something in the future, or maybe even just spray paint it. I'll have to see. And then I secured again the wire loom going up the transmission bell housing to the top of the engine compartment. Then let me show you where I tapped in to go into the cab of the truck real quick. All right, although I have some gold or whatever RTV, the high temp RTV on here, you can use any kind of RTV if you want, but I've got a grommet, and what I've done is I've drilled through the factory block off for where the clutch would be. Of course, being an automatic, there's no clutch. And then I ran the wires in there. All three looms come up and connect together, and then of course I electrical taped it. So what I'm going to do, now that I know that these are in place and everything is working good, I'm going to pull the wires out a little bit. I'm going to spread a lot of clear silicone on them, and then I'm going to slide them back in and put a little bit more clear silicone, because I don't want any fumes whatsoever from the engine to be entering into the cab. And believe it or not, a small hole like that, if the pressure is just right inside the cab, you could get it to where you pull fumes in there. And then of course, since this is some gold paint, I'll hit this with spray paint to make it black again in the future, just to make it a little nicer. But I wanted to secure that grommet and make sure that it didn't move around, because the hole was slightly sloppy, but just enough that I wanted to make sure that it wasn't going to be an issue. So again, all the gauges, the link's going to be down below for them, and that's going to pertain to this vehicle with those gauges, and you can pretty much put the gauge in the pillar on any F150, F250, F350 with any engine. It's just the locations are going to be slightly different where you tap into. In my case, this is what a 460 looks like, and I wanted to share that with you. Again, if you're wanting these gauges or that pillar pod, click the link down below. It'll take you right to it. That way you have the exact same setup I have. But for a 460, this really makes it nice. This is going to be a towing vehicle, and that transmission temp sensor, that's pretty much needed. So I can tell whenever I'm working the transmission a little hard, or maybe if I have a problem. Maybe I might have something wrong with my solenoid pack and it's not locking up the clutches the way that it should and they're slipping. That would let me know, because the temperature would jump up considerably. And the main reason I did this is because I do have a water coolant issue with this vehicle, and I haven't quite figured it out. Of course, the factory gauge, I know where it should run on the gauge from having Fords all my life, and knowing that NORMAL and the word normal, how the needle should read and when it should read in different places. But there is always a little bit of variance between vehicles. So I went ahead and added a water temp gauge to give me a good idea of exactly what was happening. And I'm glad that I did, because my suspicions were correct, and this thing is running a little hot. So I'm going to dig into the cooling a little bit more today, but I wanted to show you how to add these gauges so you too can be a little bit more safe with your vehicle and know what's going on with it. I appreciate you guys watching. Thanks. Bye.